For Engineering News in Johannesburg, I'm Darlene Creamer. Author Peter Venison joins me to discuss his memoir, Soul, My Friend and Adversary, Saul Kerzner. Your book provides a revealing behind-the-scenes look at the life of the charismatic and often controversial business tycoon Saul Kerzner, whom you knew as a longtime associate, friend, and ultimately an adversary. Let's begin with Saul's early life. Could you tell us about his childhood? Born in Durban in 1935.
Yes, I can tell you a little about it, Darlene, but clearly I wasn't there. Yes, he was the late son of an immigrant from, they were called Litvak immigrants from Lithuania. And he was born in Durban, but his father came to the country as an immigrant without any of his family. They later joined him. He was the last child of the family. Not long after he was born, his mother passed away. So effectively, his eldest sister, who was roughly 20 years older than him, became his mother and was a very, very strong figure in his life. At a certain point, the family had moved to Johannesburg. They had opened a cafe there. They weren't rich. Came from a pretty poor neighborhood. But Sol was obviously a very, very clever student and eventually finished up going to university in Johannesburg and thereafter joining a leading accounting firm. But he was also a sport. I mean, he was short in stature. He made up for that with his character. He took up boxing and was successful at wrestling. He even did so for his country at one point. But he wasn't all sport. He played the piano. He could play the piano accordion. So he was very obviously a very talented young man.
When did you first meet Saul Kerzner, and how did you come to work with him?
I met Saul Kerzner after he had started his career in the hotel business. The family had a small hotel in Durban, so he was sort of a little wedded to the idea of the industry. But he had seen a big, big gap in the marketplace. He didn't want to be managing other people's books as a talented auditor. And he had seen through his sort of family's connection to the small hotel business that South Africa really was ripe for tourism, but really didn't have any tourist facilities. So he saw this gap, but had very little money because it's highly intensive capital exercise building a hotel. He had little money, but he wanted to somehow get into that business. So he'd invested all the money he had and raised a lot of money from the clients that he'd been doing the books for, so to speak, who obviously liked him and obviously trusted him and obviously thought he was smart. And having raised some money, he decided to build a hotel out at Umhlanga Rocks, which is about 11 miles up the coast from Durban. He couldn't afford to get the land in Durban, and Umhlanga Rocks was a little village. It hadn't been developed at all as a tourist facility as it has now. But to the surprise of his investors, he didn't put his money into the building. He put his money into running around the world looking at other resorts and looking at the resort business and the hotel business in the more developed part of the world from that point of view. And where he got his inspiration was, in fact, in Miami, where he stayed for a while at the Fontainebleau Hotel, which is a very large hotel, still there on Miami Beach. And he saw how successful this hotel was and learned a few lessons from it, which he tried to incorporate and did incorporate to some degree into the one he was going to build, the Beverly Hills Hotel and Umhlanga Rocks. And the main thing he learned from the manager there, who's a chap called Ben Novak, was that you've got to figure out how to satisfy guests. And you don't satisfy guests by just giving them the basics. When they get the basics, like a bed or a clean sheet or, a nice big towel or whatever, they're not satisfied. All they are is they're not dissatisfied. What Ben Novak taught Sol was that you have to go beyond meeting the minimum expectations, and you have to provide things that are beyond those expectations. So Sol watched Ben Novak running his massive hotel. And one of the things he learned is all the bedrooms in the hotel all faced the sea, all faced the ocean. So the back of the hotel looked pretty sad in a sense architecturally. But what mattered was when you walked into your hotel room, you didn't walk into a room with a view of another building or a sideways view of the sea. You walked in and had a full glass view of the ocean and the beach and the birds and the sky and everything else. And people said, well, that's a very wasteful way to build a hotel because most hotels in America at the time were squeezed onto sites on the coast, the ones that were on the coast I'm talking about, resorts, and they had a hallway down the middle and rooms on either side, which meant either one side was going to see the backyard and the other side was going to see the sea, or both sides were going to see like a quarter of the sea around the corner. And Ben Novak said, no, that's not right. I can charge more if I give everybody a room of the sea. It will be a more expensive way to build, but long run, I'll have a full hotel and I can charge more. And so when Sol came to build the Beverly Hills, something he'd never done before, of course, and his investors were pretty nervous. They were doubly nervous when they found he was going to sort of waste half the site by only having all the rooms looking one way. But he was insistent that's what he should do. And that's exactly what he did. He also was insistent that he build a pool there that was far bigger than was needed for the, I think, 72 rooms in the hotel, because he had also observed that in a resort hotel, although the sea is important, maybe, the pool is more important because it's a gathering place for people. It's where people spend probably half the time that they're in the hotel, down by the pool. Therefore, he built a huge pool relative to the size of the hotel. And the pool became the epicenter of the activity in the day for the people that were there, which meant his pool manager was a very important person, more important to him than the restaurant manager. And at night, he built a nightclub. It was called the Copacabana because he chose simple names that people would recognize. So Beverly Hills, Copa, they're all other people's names. But in South Africa at the point, they conjured up dreams. So he tried to play to people's dreams. And in the little Beverly Hills 72-room hotel, he created these dreams. And at night, he created more dreams because instead of building a club or a music club or a dance floor or something on the top floor of hotels, which what most other international companies were doing at the time, he built it underground. You had to go down to his nightclub because he quite rightly said, you don't want to be looking at an effing view in a nightclub. You need to be looking at people, or people need to be looking at you. So you go down to a nightclub. So these are some of the little concepts, little nuances that he picked up when he went on his tour to learn the business. And Sol learned his lessons well. So now, when did I first meet him? Long answer to your question. I was running the first brand new luxury hotel built in London after the war. It was the Carlton Tower in Sloane Street, Knightsbridge. And I was quite young. Luckily, it was an American company who didn't care whether you were young or old. They cared whether you could do the job. And I happened to be the manager. I'd only been the manager for about a year. And I got called to the reception one day because there was a man shouting and swearing at the top of his voice at the girls on the desk. And they couldn't calm him down. And what had happened is our laundry had ruined his girlfriend's dress. And it was obviously an expensive dress. It wasn't a very big dress, but it was obviously an expensive dress. And he was shouting and swearing and effing and being. And anyway, I went to see him and I said, no, excuse me, sir, why don't we step into my office, have a cup of tea and sort this thing out? Well, that sort of calmed him down. So he came into my office and I said to him, I'm sorry, I've ruined Mrs. Kerzner's dress. And he sort of giggled and said, it's not Mrs. Kursner. And anyway, that was that. I calmed him down. I offered for whoever it was to go up the road to Sloane Street to the fancy shops, buy herself a new dress, and we'd pay for it, and that's fine. Anyway, 2 weeks later, he came back to my office. He said, I want you to work for me. And I said, there's no way I'm going to work for you. And he explained he was intended to build a hotel group. He needed an operator. And I said, no way. My father-in-law was a leading light in the anti-apartheid movement in London. If you looked at pictures of rallies in London, you'd see my father-in-law there in the front row. So there's no way I'm going to go to South Africa. Anyway, he was persistent. And at one point he said to me, look, I want you to come on a week to South Africa. You'll see it's not all it's made out to be. It's not as bad as you're being told. And I said, look, Sol, I'm married. I've got 4 children. There's no way I'm coming on a holiday to South Africa. So I said, at the very least, I'd have to bring my wife. So he didn't have much money at the time. So I remember he used to walk to the window of my office and there was silence for a while. Then he turned around and he said, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll buy half your wife's ticket to come to South Africa. And it was a sort of grin on his face. And it was sort of a bit irresistible. So I stuck up my hand and I said, okay, I'll do that, Sol. But I'm warning you that I am 99.9% sure I will not join you, but I'll come and have a look at your request. And he grinned and he said, excuse my language, he said, I'll take my fucking chances. And that was that. I mean, he took his chances. So I came to South Africa. He gave Diana, my wife, and myself a beautiful tour of the place, showed us the potential of the place. And I then said, I'm not going to join you because there was just something that I thought this man could be a difficult man. So I said, I'm not going to join you. He was furious. And anyway, I came back to England. The next day, I got a fax from him offering me a slightly different job, an elevated job to the one he was offering me in the first place, with a salary twice as high. So I said to my wife, what the hell, let's go and take the adventure, which we did and never regretted it.
If you could speak to us about the creation of Sun City and the iconic Lost City.
There was a big gap between the Beverly Hills and Sun City. Mm-hmm. During that time, we built up a chain, the largest chain of hotels, as I'm sure you know, in South Africa at the time, which became the Southern Sun chain. And they really started in the Durban area with the Elangeni Hotel, which turned out in the end to be 450 rooms, all single banked, all overlooking the beach, as was the style. And then we opened the Malibu down the road, which I think now is a Holiday Inn, but at the time it was the Malibu Hotel. And in all cases, we marketed very, very heavily. So his emphasis was very much on pre-opening marketing. When we opened the doors of a hotel, they were full the first day. It was head on, and it was difficult. Then we opened the Beacon Isle, which was particularly difficult. But gradually we picked off all of the good spots in South Africa for tourism, both domestic and foreign. We then bought a few other hotel companies that were trying to get going or had got going. We then took over a company that the SAB, the breweries, had, which was more of a commercial hotels. They were called Transito. We took them over. We put in bars. We put in entertainment. We did all the things we did to turn them into Southern Sun hotels. And that was that. We started also to develop in the Indian Ocean. But we had a competitor, and the competitor had the benefit of casinos in Lesotho and Swaziland, which, as you know, were independent countries. And there they allowed casinos. So we were a little aggrieved to see all the revenue we could have been getting if we'd had a casino in South Africa, which was filtering out every weekend over the borders into Swaziland and Lesotho. So when the opportunity came, when the homeland policy, the Bantustan policy came into being, although in our view it was completely ridiculous policy, nevertheless, it gave us the chance to say to the leaders of those homelands, why don't you, if you are truly independent, flex your muscles and say you are going to allow casino gambling. Because if you're truly independent, then you can do that. We were in a lucky position because foreign investors weren't interested in the Bantustans. It was very difficult for Bophuthatswana, which was the closest homeland to Pretoria and Johannesburg. It was very difficult for Lucas Mangope, who was the president there, to do a deal with Lesotho and Swaziland, because all that was going to do was milk their profits, and they wouldn't want to agree to that. So we were basically not handed the thing on a plate, but it was there on the plate, and we took it and never regretted it. But Souls had the vision to say, I'm not just going to build a casino, because one day things could change. One day there could be a casino in Cape Town or in Johannesburg or whatever. And then who's going to drive all the way up to what we called Sun City then to go to a casino? What I want to do is build a resort, a place where people can go. They don't have to go anywhere near a casino if they don't want to, but it's got to be a resort. It's got to have a great pool. It's got to have golf courses, tennis courts, aquaria, children's things, boating, whatever, all the stuff that started to be put into Sun City. And it's got to have live entertainment, theaters and other stuff. So he at that time had the vision, because we could have just put up a hut with slot machines in it and we'd have done very well. He said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to create something that will be the basis of a tourist industry. And that was a very sensible decision at the time, because it would have been much easier not to do that. So that's really how we got into developing the first Sun City. But it was always in our mind to do more than the one hotel. But we did one hotel first, and it was chaos opening. I was in charge of opening operationally, and we were expecting maybe 2,000 people would come. We had 350 rooms, so we knew we got 700 people there because we were booked out. But we thought 2,000 people would come, and as far as we can tell, about 7,000 or 8,000 people came. So it was chaos, total chaos. And I thought I'd get the sack, because I was administrating the chaos. I was in charge of the chaos. And I don't know, 7 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from Sol. I'd only been in bed about, I don't know, 3 hours or something. And he said, I want to see you in the office. And I thought, oh, I'm going to get fired, you see, for failing to cater for these people, all these thousands of people. And there he was with a pencil on a piece of paper with a grin on his face, and says, sit down, we're going to design a new hotel. So I said, I got to sort this one out first, Sol. No, sit down. Someone else can sort it out. We're going to design a new hotel. We're going to build it quickly, because this place is going to be an effing success. He hadn't been concerned about the fact that there was a line at the toilets because we hadn't built enough, and so on and so forth, or that there was a queue to get to the show and all this sort of thing. He wasn't concerned. That to him was good news. That wasn't bad news. To me, it was bad news. I couldn't cope. To him, this was great news, because if we build another 500 rooms, we can, we'll take care of this problem. So that's how we got into that. And that's how we got into entertainment, because we needed to do things to entertain people at this resort. And that's how we dreamt up things like the $1 Million Golf, and started building a big arena up there. Started to bring people to South Africa, two South Africans, I should say, really famous people in the entertainment business. Eventually finished up there with about 2,200 rooms, I think. We needed to entertain and not just put slot machines there. So that's how that got going.
During the apartheid era, South Africa was isolated internationally, with neighboring African countries refusing to allow its aeroplanes to refuel or cross their airspace. I understand that South Africa's foreign minister at the time, Puk Botha, turned to the then exiled Sol Kursner for assistance. Could you share more about this period?
Well, to some extent I can. It's true that South African Airways, if they wanted to fly, say, to Nice in France, had got to fly all the way around the bulge of Africa, which took an extra 4 or 5 hours. So it was totally impractical. The African countries just did not allow South African planes over their airspace. So the government of South Africa at the time, through their foreign office and people working there, attempted to do deals with various offshore and generally poor places who could do with a little financial help. So the Comoran Islands, for example, was en route to the east, and therefore it would make a good refueling point. So the Comoran Islands were one where the South African government helped out financially with building airport, resort hotel, that sort of thing. The details of how they helped out, I don't necessarily have, but there was obviously deals. Going up to Europe, Cape Verde was off the west coast of Africa, island state, quite poor. There again, there was an airport built, which meant that SAA planes could refuel on the way to Europe. And so there were these deals that had gone on. And the way Sol eventually got involved in one of these deals, as you will know, he had been accused of bribing one of the homeland leaders, the Transkei. He didn't bribe him, and I'm not able to go into all the details of the case, but he did pay him some money to buy an illegal slot machine alley, whatever, that had been created against the agreement. The agreement was we would have an exclusive casino, which is called the Wild Coast, and it was a costly place to build. And so the deal was we had the exclusive rights to gaming. So when we found we didn't have the exclusive rights to gaming, Sol decided to try to do something about it. But this was not a bribe. And it was a personal amount that had been paid by Sol. It didn't even involve the company, as it happened. And he was actually doing the company a favor. But he was accused that it was a bribe, and eventually there was some danger that he would be arrested and so on. And so he left the country, very sadly, because he left right at the peak of his career in one sense, although he peaked again later. But he was forced to sell up and leave. But the government knew his talents, and there was a certain point where it was useful for the government to have Sol revive what they had failed to do in the Comoran Islands. They'd financed this hotel in the Comoran Islands, and it was forever closing down. No one could get it to work. It was a beautiful site. And at one point, Sol was approached and said, "Can you help us?" And because Sol said, "Well, I'll help you if you help me, because I've still got this ghost hanging over me of this alleged bribery." And anyway, I can't say what happened after that because I honestly don't know. But nevertheless, we stepped in and made the Comoran Island Hotel successful. And the case eventually came to nothing, let's put it that way.
And through these dealings with Pukbota and what you've explained to us, it paved his way to return to Botswana and eventually South Africa. Please, can you tell us about his meeting and relationship with Nelson Mandela after Mandela's release from prison?
Yes, well, the situation in South Africa was that there were a lot of leaders around who had originally been in South Africa but were now in their own homelands. And the leaders had, in many cases, done quite nicely for themselves. But of course, South Africa would never be South Africa again until they were reunited and drawn back into South Africa. So if you're the leader of Botswana or Transkei or wherever, and you're doing a good job at doing it and you're living nicely, it's not necessarily the right thing in your mind to come and rejoin South Africa. Madiba obviously wanted to put South Africa back together, and we were some of the people that knew all these leaders in these homelands because we had businesses there, in some cases the biggest business that they had. So we were able to help Madiba in almost introducing him to people that he hadn't met, who he wanted to persuade to give up their local kingdoms and come back into South Africa. So I think we were helpful in that regard because we could lobby on his behalf. We first met him probably 2-3 weeks after he'd been out of jail, and he asked to see Sol. And Sol thought it would be a good idea if we just had him round to the house for supper, sort of home cooked supper sort of thing, more informal. I and my wife happened to be living in Sol's house at that time because we were building our own house, and he said, "You can have my house," which is very kind of him. And he was on the board, but he was busy elsewhere in the world. So he only came every 3 months or so. So he was like our guest in his house, if you see what I mean. Anyway, so Sol said, why don't we get Mary, who was our cook, to cook some supper for Nelson Mandela? Because Mary nearly fell on the floor when we said, you've got to cook supper for Nelson Mandela. He did arrive. I was the only one there when he arrived, and it was, I have to say, I said it in the book, it was like Jesus Christ walking through the door. I mean, this man was so famous that it was just wonderful to have the privilege to meet him, let alone, have him to dinner. And he walked in and he said to me, I understand, Peter, we're going to have some dinner. And I said, yes, Mary's cooking some chicken for us or something. And he said to me, will there be enough for my driver? And I said, yeah, of course, we'll sort something out for your driver. And then he said, it will be the same food I have, won't it? And I thought, I'm not sure. I'll see if I can get Mary to make four, I don't know, there were five of us there. If she could make 5 into 6. So Mary nearly fell on the floor, but anyway, she said, oh, she'd do her best. And then I came back and he said, oh, I forgot to say, Peter, they've given me a security man. So I said, oh, and he said, will there be enough to feed my security man? I said, yeah, probably. I'll see what I can do. Whereupon Sol arrived and Buddy Horton from Kursner arrived, and I went and helped Mary in the kitchen sort out how we were going to make 4 into 6 or 5 into 7 or whatever it was. So we sat down and we had a lovely dinner with him. And I won't go on about it, but beautiful stories, a wonderful storyteller, Madiba, but so humble, but with a great sense of humor. And that was the start of a friendship, really, mainly between Sol and Madiba, but also Buddy Horton and myself. But we then set about trying to help him as a little bit of help. It was a big, big picture he had to sort out, but we helped a little. We lent him the aeroplane, so he could go to these places, and went and introduced him to people that he met and helped a little bit with negotiation and that sort of thing. But it was more a relationship, firstly to help the man, but secondly it became a friendship between Sol and Nelson Mandela. Mandela would say, where Sol goes, things happen. They were very fond of each other. It was an unusual sort of relationship in a way because of total opposites, but they became very friendly.
Sol's personal life was marked by tragedy. Could you tell us about his son Howard, known as Butch, his role in the business, and the tragic accident that claimed his life?
It was marked by tragedy. The first tragedy was the death of his second wife, Shirley, who was manic depressive. She was a very bubbly and beautiful young lady, but she was a little troubled, and more troubled by the fact that Sol was more at work than at home. And that was the first tragedy in his life. And that really almost stopped his career because he sort of had a period of reflection. I've been doing all this work. I haven't been attending to my family sort of feelings. And he did make adjustments in his life after that, but that was a terrible time for him. And Butch, his son, when got killed, actually working for us in a helicopter crash. And of course, that was another tragedy. Butch didn't want to come into the business. Butch had been to university in America, very sharp brain in terms of numbers, like his dad, but wasn't particularly interested in the hotel business. When he did join us, because Sol needed to be able to say to investors that if something happened to him, Sol, the shareholding would stay in the family and would go to Butch. So he wanted Butch to learn the hotel business. He, in fact, asked me, he didn't need to ask me, he could have told me, but he asked me if I'd teach Butch the hotel business. But what I learned in teaching Butch the hotel business, or trying to, is that he wasn't interested in the hotel business. What he was interested in was the finance business, and hotels were a way, in a sense, of investing and growing money. But I remember clearly one time, Diana, my wife, and I were with Butch in Cuba. We were sitting in the car waiting for someone, and she said, "Are your kids going to go in this business, Butch?" And he says, "No way. I want my kids to be doctors or dentists or doing something useful." I mean, his view was really we weren't doing anything useful for the world, which I didn't agree with, but that was Butch. He's more interested in the balance sheet. That said, I mean, he did grow into the business, and at the time when he died, he was effectively running the business as it was at that point. But that was the business overseas at that point. That was in the Middle East and in America and in the Caribbean, which was the driving force for us building the biggest casino in America, which was in the Indian Reserve north of Connecticut, between Connecticut and New York. He was the driving force there, there's no question. So he played a very, very big role in the business as it grew. And had he not have died, there was a reasonable chance, I think, that the company at the time would have been the developers of the casino in Singapore. There was a reasonable chance of that, although the politics were always against that. There was a chance because there was a magnificent building on an island that was being developed, and Butch was a driving force there. So he made a big contribution in the end, Butch, even though, as I say, it wasn't his first love.
And Peter, finally, your relationship with Sol Kerzner spanned decades and left a profound mark on the tourism industry. Mm-hmm. As you reflect on your journey with him, what moments or lessons stand out most to you? When was he most your friend, and when was he most your adversary?
Well, often he was my adversary when I was working for him because we argued a lot. I was often the last port of call. People were frightened of him. He had a temper, Sol, and as I've said in my book, he was the only man I know who could use the F word as a noun, a verb, and an adjective, all in the same sentence. And he could really let fly with his language and his temper. But he got over it. I mean, he'd have a violent temper with you because you'd done something he didn't like 1 minute, and then 10 minutes later he'd say, "Come on, let's go and have a beer." So there were lots of times where he was difficult. But our fallout eventually became actually after I'd retired from working for him. And I found myself working for other companies that were working against him. And we had some bitter fights. And I think I was used to some extent because people knew I knew how to handle him. And he didn't like that. So we had some quite substantial legal run-ins. Not necessarily in the latter years interpersonal run-ins, but we were often sitting on the other side of a court, which don't really want to do with your best friend. But he had the ability to forget, and I think I had the ability always to admire him. So, he went as far at one point as trying to serve legal papers on me at one of my son's weddings in New York. So, he would go to all sorts of lengths. So you felt well, I'll go to all sorts of lengths too. But I think because we knew each other well, there was, hopefully, I'd like to think anyway, a mutual respect, even though we were enemies from time to time.
That was Peter Venison discussing his book, Soul.